Good afternoon. We'll be here for a 1 hour session. We ask that everyone double, triple check your cell phones, make sure they're on silent. If you need to make a phone call, please take it out to the hallway. And the door does slam, so if you do have to exit, please try to make sure you keep it from slamming. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad we have people in the room. Whenever I do things like this, it's enough people. So I'm glad that you're here. I am a big fan of the Safe and Together model, and I take every opportunity I have to introduce this model to as many systems, as many players, as many parties as possible. So I'm really happy that you're here today. I'm happy that we're here to share this information with you. I have been working at the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for just over 11 years now, and a lot of my work has been related to the intersection of domestic violence and helping really understanding how domestic violence impacts both survivors and children. This model also really talks a lot about how domestic violence impacts children, even if children don't see or hear that violence, and provides tools and strategies and ways to engage with families while on the same type of program. So this work is connected to the work that I've done and my entire career, which I was able to say now is almost a 40-year career, has been working with different systems that are addressing and responding to domestic violence. And I think this is a great model for all systems. So as I said, I'm really happy to be here with you today. Can everybody hear me okay, or should I turn on the mic? Yeah, I can turn on the
Oh,
mic. If you can hear me?
The mics, that would be great.
Sorry, I
No,
forgot.
you're fine, you're fine.
Let's see if this works. Good? Okay. I'm Kristen Wagner. I'm Assistant Counsel at the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. I've been here just over a year now, and I have a background in immigration and domestic violence related civil legal services. And so later on, I'll be touching upon how New York State domestic relations law and family court matters utilize or at least cross paths with some of the Safe and Together tenants. And so I'll pass it on to you.
okay. Hi, all. Oh, Bonnie, I'll take. My name is Bethany Whiting. I work for Over the Bridge for the Office of Children and Family Services, and I am the Safe and Together practice implementation lead. So I've been, we'll talk about that in a second, actually. We have been implementing this across the state in the child welfare system, right? So that's where my work is. I've spent the last about 15 years in child welfare, starting as an investigator and preventive worker, all that good stuff. And now really focus my work on that integration or intersection of domestic violence and child welfare, right? And what that looks like. That's me and Bonnie. Actually, you're up first.
So at OPDV, we have 3 pillars, and we try to, all of our work, right, and all of systems and all of agencies and organizations that are responding to domestic violence in any way, we encourage them to have these 3 pillars as well. We will always want our work to be survivor-centered. We want to see the survivor as the expert in their lives, and we want to partner with and take lead from them because they know better than anyone what will keep them safe and what will put them at risk. We know that domestic violence is trauma, so we want all of our work to be trauma-informed, and we want the work of all systems that may be engaging with survivors to also be trauma-informed. And sometimes you may be dealing with survivors or perpetrators of domestic violence or children who grew up in homes where there was domestic violence, and you may not know that, right? They may not present that to you. So what we encourage is that all services and all systems are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. We know that how people show up in many ways to our systems and to our services may be impacted by their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status, right? And so we want to always be thinking about how is this person showing up and how do their foundational identities impact how they're going to access services and how are those foundational identities being used by that perpetrating person as tactics of coercive control. This is the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline number. You can text, call, chat. There's 24 hours available. Every county in New York State has a domestic violence program that also has local hotline numbers. This New York State hotline number can connect you to those local programs. And we really encourage all systems that may be responding and engaging with victims and perpetrators, right, to know who their local domestic violence provider is and to establish a relationship with them prior to when you have some horrific case, right? It's always easier to reach out for support and services when you've established that relationship.
All right, so we're just going to try to get this briefing in less than an hour. So really, this model is pretty robust, but we're just going to run through the basics of it, right, and kind of give you a high-level overview of what the model looks like. So the Safe and Together model, you know, these are the objectives when we are working with systems, child-serving systems, to talk about, right? The model focuses on a perpetrator pattern-based approach, which is really how it shifts from what we're doing currently in the way that I train it, right, to child welfare, but it does apply to other systems, which we'll look at. We're going to talk today a little bit briefly about the model principles, the components, how that guides your work with families, right? And introduce, or at least touch on how this model is a way to enhance our work with families experiencing domestic violence. And so the mission is to create, sustain, and nurture a global network of domestic violence-informed child welfare professionals, communities, and systems. This model was born out of, from David Mandel, who was a CPS-DV collaborative, right? He worked in child welfare, but he was a domestic violence advocate and saw the same issues and people struggling in the same ways over the years, and that's where this came from. And so really we say it's more of a systems change model. Although it is focused often in child welfare, it really applies across the board, and we use it that way you know, with our partnership here between OCFS and OPDV. So it is a global model. It really is all over. You know, it's started here in Northeast, actually, not New York, but close. This, I would say, isn't really fully accurate. They do a lot of work with this model, integrating it into judicial systems in Australia. I would say that's probably the most prominent one right now, where they've really brought it through all of their court systems. And, you know, it's definitely showing some pretty great work. Bonnie and myself are both certified trainers for the Safe and Together model, so we do get to connect with the trainers across the globe and hear, you know, what are they doing, how are they seeing this impact the work they're doing with families, right? But here's where we are, right? And so in New York, this model started here because we used to also have a CPS-DV collaboration, right, and it was funded. My office at OCFS used to be the ones that oversaw that funding. We had, I want to say, 17 or 18 programs in counties across the state that utilized it, right, where they had a CPS advocate, or an advocate inside their child welfare system. And we lost that funding, and so when we lost that funding, we ended up turning to this model to see how could we bring this, because really the intent of it is that cross-system collaboration, right? How do we get everybody on board that's working with these families to see better outcomes for the children and families that are experiencing domestic violence? So we did that, I want to say, right around the pandemic. Everything is like pre and post-pandemic, right? So right about that time, we started this project. We got the funding. We became certified trainers. And this is where we are as of right now, right, in 2025. So we are in 35 counties. This map shows you where we are as far as child welfare, right? And so that's what our team is doing. We're going around, we're working with child welfare, and then hoping to bring in those other systems while we're there, right? So this is at varying degrees. Some counties have brought in their attorneys and have their attorneys go through it. Some counties have asked us to come and do a one-day briefing for their attorneys and speak to how that works, what their workers are learning, what they might see, how they might want to see it present. We do one-day overviews. We do coaching. So my office does coaching with counties that have started this. So that's where we're looking at those high-risk cases, or those cases that workers are really struggling with. And we're looking at it and then applying the model to it and seeing now how can we work with this family. What we are hoping and what we are starting to do is really build this into our cross-system collaboration work, right? And so OCFS and OPDV are going to really start doing that with our high-risk teams, bringing out one-day overviews, bringing out this work and seeing how can we impact, right, those teams and get everybody using the same language, the same approach. Really excited for that. That's starting very soon. And what else about this map? Like we said, it's varying degrees, so some counties are really all in, some are just, let's start it and see where it goes. Bringing in, other systems. And really this, I feel like that's it for the map, right? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
The state has embraced this model, and they are training every single new CPS worker, foster care worker, anyone new coming into the system is being trained in the one-day overview of this model. So every new CPS worker, foster care worker, any of those child welfare workers that are coming in as part of their training for that job, they get the 8-hour training in this model. And then there's no mandate for counties to train all of their other staff, but what we're seeing is that different counties, as Bethany said, at different levels are requesting for the training. So some counties are saying, come in, do the 4-day core training for every single person in our county, in our district. Others are saying, come in, train our supervisors, come in, do some of our people. The hope and the goal, right, over the long term, and it is culture shift, right, it is system change, so it takes time, is that all of the counties will have all of their people trained in the 4-day core model, and will have got coaching, and that their partners, other people in their counties, right, health department, probation department, law enforcement will also have an understanding of the model, right? So the idea is that all people in that county have the same understanding.
Yeah, right, because it's hard because we're trying to, like I said, cram a big project into a really short time frame right now. But I would say the reason that we're seeing this spread and that counties are asking us, right, voluntarily asking us to come is often because these are the most complicated cases that you all know that, right? And we're asking child welfare workers who are often often right out of school, right, go to a training and then they're working with these families to navigate that, right? And so it's difficult. And and being as though that's my background, it's where it came from, I often share and talk a lot about how poor my practice might have been then and how this model really is shifting it. And it's really, we're seeing some really great changes, and it is culture shift, right, around in the whole agency and even for ourselves, really, truly. So you're gonna at least hear a little bit about what the model looks like, right? Today, not too much, but we always say this slide is kind of is what the model is. So, right, the foundation of the model, those principles and those critical components, Bonnie will at least run through those with you so you can see, how we approach it. This is where we start. If you do, or these counties that have and other agencies that have taken the 4-day core, we utilize something called a mapping tool, which is wonderful. And that's where, when we do bring this to other systems, and attorneys love the mapping tool. Right, because it's really focused, it's behaviorally focused, it's focused on the person choosing harm, right, and how that's impacting the whole family. So we use some of those tools in the actual training, but really the goal, right, is that improved cross-system collaboration. Again, how can we get everybody on the same page, using the same language, approaching families this way, and then seeing some actual change and accountability for perpetrators, right? That's a big part of this model. Is that, can we put the focus there and see what does that accountability look like and how can we get it, right? And again, that is very different based on your role, right? But ultimately, our hope is for those better outcomes for the families we're working with. And I do think that meets all of our roles, right? Regardless of where you are, if you're in this work, it's to help families be safer, right? So when we are focusing on child welfare, we're really talking about what is your assessment looking like for domestic violence. It's often just, here's an incident, one thing happened, and then we're working with a family and moving on. This is about moving our assessment wider and really talking about what coercive control looks like, get better partnerships with survivors, and ultimately work towards better case plans working with those families, right, to reach our goals of safety, permanency, and well-being. So, okay, there you go. This is good too.
So there is a participant guide that goes along with this training. I
training or not, so if you had access to that, but I have my card up here, and there's also some other cards about the model. There is a participant guide, and in that participant guide is a domestic violence informed continuum of practice. So anyone that wants to get that participant guide, just send me an email if you didn't get it through the app or whatever, and I'll make sure that you get that participant guide, because there really are pieces about the model in that, and so I would really like to send that to you. So we're talking about creating domestic violence informed practice, and what this continuum does is it defines across many sectors, right? If you're engaging with a perpetrator, if you're engaging with a victim, how you're talking to and interviewing children, how does it sound when you're talking about domestic violence, right? Are you considering the person's culture, race, ethnicity in your approach and in your engagement with families? And it goes across each of those things, and it defines very clearly and gives very specific examples of what it looks like and sounds like if you're behaving in ways that are domestic violence destructive or domestic violence neglectful. And then it also defines what it looks like if you're behaving in ways that are domestic violence competent or proficient. And so what we're using is this continuum, right? And the goal is that people are always moving their practice from that side to this side, right? We will all engage at different points in time in ways that are destructive or neglectful, right? We all have biases about perpetrators. We all have biases about victims. We may just have a bad day. One perpetrator or one victim may remind us of someone that we really didn't like or struggled with in the past, right? So, and Bethany mentioned, right, as she's been going through her career knowing this, she's engaged in domestic violence destructive practice. I've been doing this work for 40 years, and I still sometimes have a victim-blaming thought that creeps into my head, right? Like, why would they do that, or how come, right? I catch myself now after 40 years, but it's important, right? We all have these biases, and we all have the risk of engaging in practice that may cause harm to victims and their children, and even to perpetrators, which is going to probably make things worse for victims and children. So we want to always be using this and moving our practice towards being domestic violence proficient, and our ultimate goal is that all systems and organizations, right, are engaging in domestic violence proficient practice. So when we're engaging in, and so this is just kind of an overview, like I said, that the continuum goes into great detail. When you're engaging in domestic violence destructive or neglectful practice, when you're thinking about domestic violence, you're only thinking about it as an adult issue, right? You're not recognizing all of the ways and potential ways that those children may be being harmed, even if they don't see it. So when we're engaging in proficient practice, we recognize that children are impacted by domestic violence and they may be harmed in multiple ways. So we want to always be being aware, right? If there's domestic violence, we need to think about how is that impacting the children, right? How are the children potentially being harmed? And we know without protective factors, without interventions, that harm to children can be lifelong. Right, so we really want to, when there's domestic violence, we don't want to just think it's about the adults, right? That it's an adult issue. It is an issue that is impacting families, how families function, and children's health over the course, really, of their lifetime without intervention and protections. We're moving away from that failure to protect model. Child welfare, historically, and Bethany can correct me if I'm wrong or add anything, right? The go-to was that perpetrating parent, right, that abusive partner, kind of becomes invisible. There may be an order of protection. They may already have left. The caseworker may be afraid, doesn't want to deal with that person. Perpetrators of domestic violence are often doing everything they can to avoid systems, right? And so what happens is all of the focus becomes on that survivor parent, and then it becomes very easy to look at that survivor parent and say, why didn't you do this? How come you did this? How come you allowed that, right? And so when we think about all of the things we think and say and all of our biases about victims, we can be very victim blaming. That causes harm to survivors. It causes harm to children. It doesn't hold perpetrators accountable. It allows them to be invisible. So we really want to move away from that failure to protect model, and we want to be focused, as Bethany mentioned earlier, that perpetrator pattern. So this model is always bringing us back to that person who caused harm as the source of risk and harm, right? So the perpetrator's behaviors, right, caused harm. The survivor's decisions and choices are limited by the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. So we're always looking at the survivor's decisions and choices and what they do and don't do in the context of the tactics of coercive control that that abusive partner is using, right? That's that perpetrator pattern-based approach, and it's moving away from that victim-blaming approach. The model uses, you've been hearing me use very gender-neutral language. I'm using person who causes harm, survivor, perpetrator, offender, right? That's all gender-neutral language to indicate what we know is true, that anyone, male or female, or someone who doesn't identify as a gender binary, right, can be perpetrators or be victims, right? So this model recognizes that, and so we use a lot of gender-neutral language. The model also uses what they call gender-responsive language, and that is language that really reflects what child welfare workers and caseworkers are most likely to see and what data shows us, which is that it is more often going to be the father that is the perpetrating parent, and so sometimes they use that more gender-responsive language. This is one of those places. So in domestic violence destructful or neglectful practice, that father or that perpetrating parent becomes invisible, right? And so all, again, that focuses on the survivor, who oftentimes will be the mother. The model, when you're engaging in proficient practice, has very high standards for fathers. It recognizes that oftentimes there are two parents, and it should not only be the mother that is responsible for the health and well-being of the children. As a society, right, we tend to immediately, if we want to think, you know, why wasn't kid dressed appropriately for school? Did they have their vaccines? How come they didn't have their lunch today? Who's their teacher? Is their homework done? Who packed the backpack? Why didn't they get breakfast? We tend as a society to go to mom for that. This model, when we're behaving in ways that are proficient, wants to recognize there are two parents that are responsible. So it has very high standards for both parents, including that perpetrating parent, which again is going to move us away from all of our focus on that victim parent, which then leads to the victim blaming. In domestic violence destructive practice, it becomes about the child versus the adult survivor. So you hear things like, the survivor doesn't care about their children. They love their partner better than their children. They're choosing their, right? All of those victim blaming statements. And we really want to move away from that and recognize and understand that oftentimes that child's safety is tied to the safety of the adult survivor. And it is often that adult survivor that is the protective factor that's helping to mitigate the damage of the trauma and the domestic violence, and that is doing many, many things, again, in spite of the perpetrator's controlling behaviors to protect and keep their kids safe. So it's a very strength-based model focusing on survivor strengths, and instead of focusing on all the things that we think that they're not doing, right, and forgetting that there's a perpetrator that is the source of risk and harm, this is really encouraging us to look at that survivor and identify the survivor's strengths and all of the things that they often have done to protect and keep their kids safe while their choices and freedoms have been limited by the perpetrator's behavior. That's a very quick overview. Please email me. I will be so happy if I get requests for the participant guide, and I will send it to you immediately. These are the principles of the model. So it's keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent. This model very strongly presents, right, that when we are talking about safety, we are not only talking about physical safety of the child, but we're talking about the emotional safety of the child. We're talking about helping that child heal from the trauma that comes with domestic violence, and we're talking about providing stability and nurturance, right? We know that those are the things that help the children heal from trauma. We know the impact of trauma can be devastating, right? So keeping the child safe and together with that non-offending parent, it is that non-offending parent who most likely is going to be the one to provide that for those children, right? And so when we remove when we do that victim blaming, right, and we say that the mom or the survivor is failing to protect, so now we've taken that one protective factor from that child, right? And that child is more isolated and is experiencing more trauma. This is not a no removal model. It recognizes that sometimes the perpetrator's pattern of behavior is such that children may need to be removed, but it is the last resort. And that first principle is that we try to keep that child safe and together with the non-offending parent. The second is, I mentioned earlier that we want all of our work to be survivor-centered. The second principle is partnering with the non-offending parent as the default position. And what that means, again, is really just trusting that that non-offending parent is the expert and knows better than anyone what will keep their child safe, what will keep them safe as a family, and they can support the work of child welfare workers and systems in how to approach and engage with that perpetrator and understand the perpetrator's pattern of behavior and the tactics that they're using and the impact. So partnering with that non-offending parent is efficient, it's effective, and we're doing that to promote the child's safety and health and well-being. And the third principle, which they're all obviously very important, but this one, I'd worked with perpetrators for many, many years in an offender accountability program. People don't like to work with perpetrators. They're not trained in how to work with perpetrators. They're not trained how to even work with fathers half the time. This model requires that you're engaging with that perpetrator, you're engaging with the father in the family, and you're not only engaging in a way that's punitive, right? It's moving away from that punitive piece. We want to still hold them accountable, but we want to recognize that they're making a choice to be abusive, and that we want to motivate them to make different choices, and the model wants to educate them and motivate them to be non-abusive in their relationships. So it is a model that recognizes that perpetrators can change and that oftentimes they may need support, and also they may need to be held accountable in order to make those changes. It requires that they engage with the perpetrator as a parent, and that they inform that perpetrator that when they are abusive to their intimate partner, they're making a parenting decision that's causing harm to their children. So they're really engaging with that perpetrator as a parent and using their parent status, right, as a motivating factor. And research shows us that that is one of the things that does motivate behavior change for perpetrators of domestic violence. If child welfare workers can be holding perpetrators accountable through their documentation, through their case plans, that's going to make it easier for other systems, particularly the court system, to hold perpetrators accountable. So we train child welfare workers, even if you never see Mr. Smith, who's the perpetrator. But if you've called Mr. Smith 10 times and said, Mr. Smith, I would like to talk to you about the health, safety, and well-being of your children, please contact me back. Or you've scheduled 5 appointments with Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith never calls you back. He never shows up for appointments. He cancels appointments. He avoids you. You've never seen him. You can make him visible and accountable in your documentation by saying every single time I reached out to discuss the health, safety, and well-being of Mr. Smith's children with him, and he did not call me back on 12 occasions. He's missed 5 appointments. When Mr. Smith then goes to family court and says, I want unsupervised visits or custody, that judge, even though we've never seen Mr. Smith, why am I giving you custody, right? You haven't shown up once to discuss the health, safety, and well-being of your children, right? So in the documentation, we can help other systems hold perpetrators accountable, while at the same time we're working and motivating them to behave differently, right? So these are the critical components of the model. These are kind of the 5 things that we need to know to have a really clear and accurate understanding of what's happening in this family. We need to know the perpetrator's pattern of coercive control. It's a very behavior-based model, so we're not just saying the perpetrator uses financial abuse or isolation. We are detailing every single behavior that is used to isolate that survivor. Every single behavior that they are using to not allow that survivor access to resources and support. So think of that power and control wheel that many of you have said, right? We're not just pulling one of those things off. We are going around that wheel and saying, what are the behaviors that fit each and every one of these? And then that is the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. And not just for the current relationship or the current incident, across relationships. So we're really getting a 360-degree picture over time, over relationships, of this perpetrator's pattern of behavior. We want to know what actions the perpetrator has taken to harm the child. We know that domestic violence intersects very highly with child abuse and neglect, even child sexual abuse. So it's oftentimes, if there is domestic violence, there is also some type of child abuse. High overlap of those cases. So we want that information. We want to know the full spectrum of everything that non-offending parent is doing and has done to keep their child safe and promote health and well-being. And we want to know the impact of that perpetrator's behavior on the child. So each of those behaviors that perpetrator is using to control the survivor parent, we're going to take that behavior and say, how is that impacting the child, right? So if the survivor's not allowed to visit family, right, on the holidays, oftentimes that means the child can't. What happens when a child is disconnected from their family, from their culture, from people who may be supportive of mitigating the damage of the trauma, right? If the survivor doesn't have access to resources, the children's basic needs may not be being met. Takes every single behavior and maps onto how does that impact the child, how does it impact the survivor, and how does it impact the family. In addition to being very aware of kind of those foundational identities and intersectionalities of race, culture, and religion, it recognizes that domestic violence very rarely shows up alone, right? It often shows up with a whole host of other problems. So if a family's dealing with domestic violence, there may be substance use issues, there may be mental health issues, there may be poverty or housing issues. Oftentimes those intersections are actually caused by the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. So the model has a very holistic look at and understanding of the complexities of domestic violence, and recognizes that perpetrators will use their own and their survivors' mental health and substance use issues as tactics. They'll use mental health coercion, substance use coercion, and that when survivors have mental health or substance use issues, it may be harder for them to access services, right, for all of the reasons that we know about. And there's a perpetrator telling her, no one's going to believe you because you're crazy, because you're an addict. So it really ties all of those things together. The multiple pathways to harm is that idea that children are harmed in multiple ways, right? So it's that perpetrator's pattern of behavior, their actions and their behaviors that are causing harm to the children, right? That harm may not always be direct, right? We tend to think there's an incident, maybe a physical incident, and the child has an injury because of a physical incident between the perpetrator and the non-offending parent. What we know is that that is not always the case. There may not be physical abuse. The child may never even see, but we know that children are impacted in many ways. Sometimes that impact will come immediately. Sometimes it might not show up for 2 years later when all of a sudden the child has an anxiety disorder, right? Or the child is depressed, or the child is isolated, or acting out in school, right? We do a whole long activity, right, about taking all of those behaviors that perpetrators might use and looking at how those may impact the child. We know that perpetrators' behaviors impact how someone parents, right? You're not going to be able to parent as well when you're experiencing coercive control. Your choices and your decisions are limited. Survivors spend a tremendous amount of time addressing and dealing with perpetrators, trying to anticipate what's next. Perpetrators interfere with the basic routine, right, because their needs to come first in that moment. So survivors are constantly being interrupted from doing the things they want to do to provide that attention to the perpetrator in the hopes of maybe avoiding, right, an incident or an escalation of violence and abuse. It affects how the family functions, right? And again, we don't have time today, but we can go through each of these things and look at how perpetrators' behaviors impact the family functioning and the family ecology, right? Loss of contact, educational, social disruptions, loss of income, housing instability. And then the harm that ultimately comes to the child, right? Whether it comes immediately and in little bits over time, or it seems like a child is kind of breezing through fine, and then they're an adolescent and they have a substance use problem and they're, stealing, they're acting out, they're involved in the criminal justice system, right? That may be 6 or 7 years after, right, where we didn't see those impacts, and now we have this adolescent who's really struggling. We talked about this, right? That mapping tool is that tool that NDV service providers like it, attorneys like it, because it really helps tie the harm to the children to that perpetrator's behavior. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, and she's going to talk about how it relates legally.
How many attorneys do we have in the room? Oh, good. Okay, a number. So, when working with victims of domestic violence, not every case you see has to do with custody and or visitation, but that's where we're going to start today. In these cases, the court is making decisions based on the best interests of the child. So, we're going to spend a moment defining that. One misconception we hear across the state frequently is that there's a presumption of 50-50 custody. However, that is not the case in New York State. Domestic Relations Law 240 states that neither parent has prima facie right to custody, but that the court must determine solely what is in the best interests of the child. Neither parent has a superior right to custody, and this also means that split or joint/shared custody is not presumptive either. So when determining best interests, what does the law say you should consider? So, New York Domestic Relations Law, Section 240, says if a parent makes a good faith allegation based on a reasonable belief supported by facts that the child is the victim of child abuse, child neglect, or the effects of domestic violence, and if that parent acts lawfully and in good faith in response to that reasonable belief to protect the child or seek treatment for the child, then that parent shall not be deprived of custody, visitation, or contact with the child, or restricted in custody, visitation, or contact, based solely on that belief or the reasonable actions taken based on that belief. So there's no standard definition of best interest. A court may consider a number of things, such as which parent has been the primary caregiver or nurturer of the child, the parenting skills, strengths, and weaknesses, and ability to provide for any special needs of children, the mental and physical health of the parents. As Bonnie was talking about, there might be mental health issues, substance abuse issues. Another thing that the court must consider is the effect of domestic violence upon the best interests of the child. Other things include work schedules and childcare plans of each parent, children's relationships with siblings and other family members, the children's wishes depending upon their age, and each parent's ability to cooperate with the other parent and encourage a relationship when it is safe to do so. But what you must consider is domestic violence. The court must consider the effect of such domestic violence upon the best interests of the child, together with such other facts and circumstances as the court deems relevant in making a direction pursuant to this section, and state on the record how such findings, facts, and circumstances factored into the direction. So if you're considering the impacts of domestic violence on a child's best interest, it's imperative to have an understanding of what domestic violence is. People assume it's physical abuse, but as we've already presented, there's a body of work about coercive control, which is what informs our understanding of what domestic violence is. Coercive control is an act or a pattern of acts, threats, humiliation, and intimidation that is used to harm, punish, or frighten. So many of you already know that domestic violence is far more than isolated incidents of physical violence. Some of the most severe cases which impact children, physical violence isn't even present. You may be presented with facts around specific incidents, but in order to fully consider the impact on a child's best interest, you need to understand the patterns of coercive control that the child is living with and navigating. These dynamics are also critical to other cases, such as family offense petitions, divorce, and child welfare cases. A large percentage of CPS cases involve domestic violence, 30 to 60%. We're working with child welfare workers across the state on how to better identify patterns of coercive control as we roll out the Safe and Together model across the state and its impact on children so that they can better document this for the courts. If you're not provided with the full context of the fact pattern, you cannot make informed decisions around the safety and well-being of a child or a survivor. And what OPDV has learned through our regional councils and our fatality review team and survivor listening sessions, as well as the systems change work we do with other state and local agencies, is that when systems that survivors and perpetrators engage with aren't domestic violence informed, it can have devastating and even lethal impacts. We know you are here today because you care about families, and all of you are working every day to make informed decisions to protect families. We want to equip you with knowledge of these dynamics and the more subtle or nuanced ways that they may play out so that you can do that. Under Domestic Relations Law 240 in custody and visitation cases involving domestic violence, as I was talking about before, it is best practice to highlight the statutory language for the court and illustrate the impact of the batterer or perpetrator's conduct on the child and the protective parent. This practice might also be useful for prosecutors when seeking to include children on criminal court orders of protection. Some best practices for prosecutors. Do we have any prosecutors in the room? Several. You should expect counterintuitive behavior by victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. You should corroborate the victim's account and rebut motives to lie. Although the victim's account is the center of the case, as we were presenting before as one of the foundations of the Safe and Together model, is to focus on the perpetrator's conduct. Collaborate with victim specialists and advocates, and do your best to lessen victim re-traumatization. So these best practices are consistent with the Safe and Together model because they focus on the perpetrator's conduct and partners with the non-offending parent as a default position. So I'm gonna go through this case with you to show how the court should adjudicate questions concerning the best interests of children when coercive control is present in the household. I want to highlight a few quotes from this opinion that anchor what we've touched on already today as part of the Safe and Together model. There has been a history of either punishing the victim for failure to protect or going to other extremes and minimizing domestic violence unless it was violence in front of a child or injured a child, and unfounding everything else. Safe and Together and this case law shows how we can avoid both extremes and actually intervene in a way that protects victims and children and holds offenders accountable for coercive control, not just physical violence. So in this case, this is matter of Aisha. This was out of New York City. I think it was the Bronx or Brooklyn, Kings County. In this case, the mother alleged domestic violence by the father. ACS filed a neglect petition against the father. The father motioned to have the petition dismissed because there was no proof of physical violence. The next few slides are going to highlight a few quotes from the decision. The most visible impact on the children alleged in this particular petition is that Ariel, a 2-year-old child, repeats the derogatory words Mr. T uses against Ms. R, including calling his mother, quote unquote, a bitch. Such language used by a toddler and the manner it is used is highly inappropriate for a child of this age and impacts Ariel's relationship with their mother, inhibiting the development of a positive mother-child attachment. And although the child is not alleged to understand the language being used, its connotations and valence are implied in its very use, undermining the child's respect for their mother and their growing sense of self as a child in relation to girls and women. As Ariel grows up, the implications of this learned behavior will continue to unfound, creating rifts in relationships that can only serve to further traumatize both the child and the child's mother. The children are also negatively impacted by the father's alleged use of them as tools in his campaign of control over the mother. The petition alleges that the father took all the children's vital documents and repeatedly threatened to take the children away from the mother if she did not listen to him. So clear behavioral pattern of coercive control, limiting the mother's ability to make proper and safe parenting decisions. So the decision goes on to list different tactics that the perpetrator used, how it inhibited the mother's ability to parent the children despite her best efforts, and the impact that the perpetrator has caused on the children from the same. So this is a perfect example of how the proper understanding and documentation can connect the perpetrator's behavior to the impact on the children and show how the victim is resilient and protective. Utilizing the children to further exert power and control over the mother creates a substantial risk of harm that not only the mother, but for the children as well. His actions and choice to use the children as a means of control over the mother show a disregard for the well-being of the children that raises serious concerns regarding his parental judgment and the effect his decisions have on the children's mental and emotional state. In addition to the significant lack of parental judgment here, this behavior teaches the children unhealthy relationship dynamics and places them directly in between the parties. So this case is an example of how a judge who is domestic violence proficient can break down the pattern of behavior of the offender through examining the tactics, the impact on the child, and the undermining of the other person's parenting, and ultimately allowed the court to render a decision which complied with domestic relations law section 240 that took into account domestic violence in a way that held parents accountable for their behaviors and viewed domestic violence not only as acts between parents, but one that impacts child functioning and creating an environment to heal. So in the court's decision, they said, most fundamentally, an environment of coercion and control does more than just undermine the children's caretaker or make them witnesses to an environment of inequality. It victimizes them directly. Residing in this tense environment impacts the children significantly in their day-to-day life, from the constant fear permeating the home to the isolation from friends and family to the changed dynamics in the household. So I have two other cases I could briefly go through as examples, or I could stop here in terms of our agenda. I'll defer to you, Bonnie. Sure. I'm going to start with the second one because it's shorter. In this case, the plaintiff mother sought modification of custody and parenting time and relocation of the children and herself to North Carolina out of New York State. The defendant father sought an order of joint custody, which was their original parenting time agreement that they had. And the father also sought to deny the mother's request for relocation. Both parties' testimonies, a forensic evaluation report, and recommendations of the children's attorney were considered at trial. And taking all of that into account, the court ultimately found that it was in the children's best interest to grant the mother final decision-making authority. After meaningful consultation with the father, granted her primary residential custody, modified the access schedule, and denied her request to relocate. And what I like about this is that it shows how, in a case like this where there were cross allegations really of abuse of the mother against the father, not really clear who was truthful, who was not. And this was the court taking all of the information that it possibly could to make that best interest of the child determination. And so you could see there was a bit of a balance in the court's decision here. The first case, in this matter, the wife asked the court for exclusive use and possession of the marital residence. They were going through a divorce, but they were both living in the house with the children. They both jointly owned the home. They had two children, sons aged 9 and 12. The husband and wife's allegations contradicted each other regarding how life in the home was. So the attorney for the sons filed an affidavit in support of the wife's application, commenting that the sons described the home as a very stressful environment and unhealthy, as they had seen and heard angry confrontations between the parents and sometimes locked their bedroom doors for safety purposes. The sons were described by their attorney as very anxious about the current living conditions and concluded that a continuation of the status quo is not in the sons' best interest. The children did express that they wanted to spend time with both of their parents, but did not want them living under the same roof. In this case, it sounds like the 9 and the 12-year-old had a lot more sense than their parents. The judge's decision noted that in this case, one disputed fact emerges. The house is rife with arguments, verbal fights, flared tempers, threats of alienation, sexual manipulation, and allegations of damage to personal property. There was no physical abuse listed there. The court went on to explain that the notion that continual verbal abuse and sharply worded verbal fights are simply petty harassments that are part and parcel of actions of divorce is outdated. And it ignores persuasive social science evidence that domestic turmoil can severely damage the lives of children, and that the lack of physical violence no longer defines the quantum of marital strife sufficient to justify an award of exclusive use. So this expansive notion of domestic violence was embraced by the New York State Legislature in Domestic Relations Law, Section 252, noting that the corrosive effect of domestic violence is far-reaching. The batterer's violence injures children both directly and indirectly. Abuse of a parent is detrimental to children whether or not they are physically abused themselves. Children who witness domestic violence are most likely to experience delayed development, feelings of fear, depression, and helplessness, and are more likely to become batterers themselves. In this case, it's undisputed that the children have already endured and may have learned the demeaning and destructive conduct of their parents. Regardless of the party at fault, the consequence, verbal violence directed against a parent and observed by the child, erodes the child's sense of home life. As such, the court granted the wife's application and held that she should be a temporary primary residential parent and ordered the father to vacate the residence. So these were just some examples of how New York State courts have, I think, grown and evolved with the definition of domestic violence and understanding coercive control, and that the absence of physical violence does not mean there is no domestic violence, and that it is the child's best interest that must be taken into account. Do you have a question?
Is there any movement legal-wise to expand on how they're looking at the caregivers? Because as many families as we have that it is a mother, father, or two parents, be it same-sex or not, you know, we have a lot of families where the children from very young are being raised by the biological parent and an extended family member from day zero. And so that other family member, though not the parent, has always been acting in the parental role, and they don't seem to have the same standing, you know, because we have a lot of people who, because the parent is on probation, in and out of jail, addicted, the primary provider has always been an extended family member, but when the people come out, the things that are going on, there's always the problem that just because the parent is the parent, the kids are by default.
Yeah.
And even though there's still domestic DIRs from the people going in the house, demanding money from their parents, we have a lot of cases where the DIRs are the kids, the adult children coming in the home, fighting with the parents. They want money, and, you know, the grandparent has the kid in the other room or whatever. But then when they go to court, it's truly a coin toss. If the new threat is not going to be, okay, I'm taking my kid back, and then not until the bad things start to happen, then CPS reaches back out to that family member. Can you take the kid? And that's disruptive, but you don't see any of that reflected in the family court system. So is there any movement in that direction, anything going on to try to close that particular gap? Because it's something that's really going on, especially in probation, where people are in and out, and it doesn't somehow seem to matter once they come out if they've completed a program or
Yeah.
something. So I was just wondering about that.
Do either of you have any responses to that?
I'm going to say just 2 sentences, and then I'm going to see what Bethany has to say. Right, so we're talking about this model, right, really about that intimate partner violence, but we get that question all the time, right, in the larger category of family violence, and I think that there's a lot of this that can also be applied to that. I don't know how much of a push there is for that to be happening right now, but I will tell you, the question you're asking, we get all the time, right? We get for kids that are being abusive to their parents, right? We get all of those environments that children are living in. So I think we could do better there.
Yeah, I don't know how do I turn this on? Help me
right
out,
here.
sorry. I'm not
Yeah.
used to this whole thing. But I will say, one thing that you mentioned around CPS getting involved, right? And I do think that maybe there's a little bit of a loophole in some sense, right? That if child welfare is involved, right, they can then petition the court, right? They can be a part of that. You know, I don't know if you see a lot of, like, if there was neglect prior, right? And I would, in my practice, we used to do a lot of like 10-6 splits, right? So where you're doing your Article 10, but then grandma's getting custody, and then when they get out, right, now what is mom doing, or dad, or whoever, to show that change? Because that is abuse as well, right? It is. But you're right, we do intimate partner violence, and that's what this training is too. But as a state as a whole, right, that is still domestic violence. It's just
Because
more
depending on which
complicated.
system, right, the definition
Right.
of what
And I
domestic
know
violence
the
covers
family
is,
court, the living together, all of
Right.
that, they
Right.
allow
It
them to still
applies.
access family court because of the household dynamic. But like I said, it becomes a real issue, and by default, the kids end up in a domestic violence situation because usually the grandparent chooses to lay back for.
Yeah, and my only my only response from the legal side is that regardless of who is petitioning for custody, that same standard applies in terms of what is in the best interest of the child. And so every case is different, and it might be that grandma is having custody is in the best interest of the child.
and if we can get those other systems, right, to understand that harm comes to children in other ways than physical violence, hopefully that will help across
I was
across
just
the board.
wondering, 'cause
Yeah.
you find on an ongoing basis, the extended family member, be it the great aunt that's just been there for forever because mom or dad got kicked out when they were 19 and they went to the sister or the brother to live for forever. They don't seem to have the same standing when they step into family court simply because they
They're not
did
the
give
parents.
birth
Yeah.
to the child, and it's very disruptive, and it poses a lot of problems when you're trying to deal with people under supervision that have children. It really turns into something. So I was just wondering.
Yeah.
But thank you.
They're the hardest, most difficult cases, I think, really, for all systems, really. And so I'm going to tie it back to that, and then we're going to let you go. As you can see, right, obviously this work can impact the legal system, right? We want family court judges to understand this model. We've trained attorneys for the children. All forensic court examiners now in New York State have to take the one-day overview of this model. So we are looking for every way in to every system. In some counties, we're working with their high-risk teams or their coordinated community response that has healthcare providers, home visiting programs, right? The model really can apply, and the more a county or a community has the same language, the same understanding, the same focus, right? Moving away from that neglectful practice, really can, I think, make communities safer and make children safer, make survivors hopefully reduce the risk, and also hold those perpetrators accountable while motivating them to change their behavior. So I'm going to ask you to take my card. I will email you the participant guide. If anybody wants a presentation on the overview of the model, I will come anywhere in the state. If I'm lucky, I'll bring Bethany with me. Maybe we'll start adding Kristen to the. But we want all systems. And the 1 hour overview we can do very easily. And any child welfare serving system that's interested in that overview model, we can talk about how we can get connected to that one-day training. Those are all virtual and are offered regularly.
Oh, and I'm just going to tell you all, this is my favorite thing that was talked about, and so I'm going to use 2 minutes to say it, because there's cards up here if you'd like to. It's called, the multiple pathways to harm that Bonnie was talking about. This is just a little desk card, a visual about it, right? Tells you a little bit on the back. But I really think, this is so great when we think about assessment and connecting that harm to kids, right? And families beyond if they see it or hear it, right? So, yeah.
I'm going to put these cards and my cards here, and I will be so happy if somebody calls me or emails me. Does anyone have any other questions? Comments? How many of you have heard of this model before today?
Well, you, because you're Orange County.
Yeah, we're going to be
We are
spending
heavily involved.
we're going to be spending some time in Orange County. Okay, so a few people, so that's great.
So I know it was heavy involved there. What's more of the law enforcement aspect?
That's a great question. Right, so law enforcement is showing up all the time at houses, right, where there's domestic violence. And a lot of times law enforcement's position, right, is this is an incident-based, right? So we would be encouraging law enforcement to really, again, and many law enforcement officers are already doing this, but really not just thinking about that incident, but thinking about, and then how on the scene you're engaging with that perpetrator, how you're engaging with and talking and communicating with that survivor, and how you're engaging and talking with children. And if you're part of a high-risk team or you're out in the community, how you speak about domestic violence and perpetrators will influence that community. I don't think we've done a full training just for law enforcement. We have had law enforcement officers in the room, and I'm always saying to them, you tell me, right? Here's all this information. How can you use it? How can it benefit you? So if anyone wants to have that conversation, I would love to have that.
Yeah, we had a training recently too, locally, right, with Albany County and Cohoes Police, and having them together too was really informative, I think, for both parties to understand each other's role and how it does and can apply. And so I think as we start building that cross systems, we should really try to bring more of that together, because those roles feel so different, but there's a lot of overlap there.
And the other thing,
And documentation.
when we
I
do
would say
this
big.
briefing, is that I always say to people, right, this was a model that really was developed as a cross-system model, but really for child welfare. And so anytime we're doing this to any system, I really want that feedback. Is there anything about this model that doesn't work for your system or is contradictory in some way to your rules and how you do things and how you see this, right? Because we want that information as well. No model is perfect. And so if there are issues or problems, I really also invite people, particularly from those other systems, to let us know what those are and see if there are ways that we can work with that.
Yeah, I would also add, speaking of law enforcement, how dangerous domestic violence cases are for you all when you respond, right? And we talk a little bit about that, and when we really spend time on assessment, that also came up, right? About how they can also make those assessments, and moving beyond an incident, knowing those patterns is also how you know that, right? It connects to lethality, and so if you're going out on a case that is likely more dangerous than perpetrator B, right? And so that comes up a lot in our training. We spend a lot of time on that as well.
And we've done some work with the juvenile justice system, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
these kids that grow up in homes where there's domestic violence, they are overwhelmingly overrepresented in our juvenile justice system. We did a lot of work with DJ Joy and talking about the impacts of domestic violence and also teen dating violence and it wasn't like it was new information, but they said they're so every day, dealing with these really difficult, challenging kids, and they forget, right, how they got to be that way and what they've experienced. And so to kind of back up and remember what they were taught, what they learned, and how these behaviors oftentimes are a result of growing up in a home where there was domestic violence. So just that perspective, too, is helpful, I think.
Yeah, so working with families, I think that more of them are scared of CPS.
Sure
Yes.
are.
More than any other type
Yep.
of system, more than police. Do you hope that this model changes that? It might take, I don't know, 20 years, but
We're in for the long haul.
We are.
will
We are.
change that fear. We also, in our stride team, don't want to include CPS in the DDHRT
Yep.
unless we absolutely have to, because everybody's like, no, I don't want to be involved with CPS. No, no, no.
I know. I know.
So,
That gets me at my core, right? Because it's, and I'm going to tell you, I think it absolutely does change it. I think that that's so multi-layered because you also have to have workers ready and willing to see domestic violence through this lens, through this, right? And move away from failure to protect. And that's difficult. And it can be difficult based in culture, based in our law, right? Failure to protect is written into our social service law and family court act. So how do we shift away, right, by focusing on the perpetrator? And that second principle with partnering, we spend a long time really looking at what does that partnering actually look like? And if we can get workers to start seeing that and changing their language when they are working with survivors, I mean, I can tell you I've seen some of those changes in counties that are really all in and trying, right? I mean, we've looked at.
I've now trained hundreds and hundreds of CPS workers.
Yeah.
And one of the things when we end up and wrap up the day that they take away is that they need to be aware of their biases and that they need to really pay attention more and identify those survivors' strengths. We also have workers that say, thank God this model is here. I have known this and the community, the culture isn't this. And
Yeah.
so that they're thrilled that there's that shift. And we really talk about wanting families to see Child Protective Services foster care as a resource and not a threat. That's going to take, that's
It
not
is.
going away quickly.
Right. Yeah.
But the model is designed to do that. And there are some workers out there, I would really say more, that are happy that this is coming. We have some that have been doing this work forever and they're just not happy about it and we're not going to change them. But every new worker is coming in. I teach those foundation classes and the new young people that are coming in, it would be absurd for them to think anything different than what we're teaching. So that's going to be
right,
a
and then
shift
they get back
also.
to their office, and then we hope that we're changing it that way too, right? And I think as a state at OCFS, we're really working to how do we get child welfare to shift, right, and be more family, right, focused, keeping. We're doing a lot, but it's going to take a long time. We'll hang out. I'll hang
Thank
out.
you.
We can hang out for a minute. Yeah,
Thank you.
we can hang out.
Hi. Hi.
Thank you, appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Tomorrow, maybe?
Actually, I will not be here tomorrow. I was here yesterday and most of today. Bye.
Is she Westchester?
I don't know.
Oh, Orange, maybe.
I don't know. Just Strive. We got to hit those Strive people over and over and over again. Come and grab her. I just always think when I did work with families for so many years, and the families, right, that were like that great aunt, like you said, who was abusive to their kids and all the kids, and there was horrible peace, and then we're sending the kids off there, like, and there's been no change, and so then there's even more difficulties, and it's reinforced.
Very, last night I was frustrated.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Frustrating because there are all these things that are out there that are